Hi everyone and welcome to Catholic Unscripted. I'm Mark Lambert, and as you can see I'm joined again today by our friend Matt Gaspers. We're doing another episode on the papacy, specifically the papacy of Pope Francis, and we're going to talk about some of the historic ways that some of the saints and church officials have talked about the inerrancy of the papacy. So it's a really useful way of looking at the historical teaching behind papal infallibility and the difference between infallibility and impeccability, and whether a pope can be a heretic, basically. Is that right, Matt?
Yeah, I think so. I mean, in my view, I think today, I hope through our discussion we can cover kind of two main points. First of all, and this is all kind of in relation to there seems to be a growing trend, at least in some circles, a temptation you might even call it, as we are in the season of Lent, to just want to say, well, Francis is a public heretic and therefore he's not the Pope. And then those who espouse that position have two kind of presuppositions that I think we need to question and take a look at. Are they credible or not? They seem to invoke St. Robert Bellarmine, and we're going to get into his 5 opinions on the matter today and really see what does he actually say about it. Um, and also Vatican I. They think that it's against church teaching to claim that it's possible for a pope to actually fall into heresy and be obstinate in heresy, which is not actually what Vatican I taught, as we'll see today. So yeah, that's kind of the ground that I figured we would cover today, and I think it'll be helpful for viewers to get a better understanding, and by God's grace, will help them with that.
Yeah, and it kind of helps us to understand that the Pope's human and can make mistakes just the same way as anyone else. And I think that's demonstrated in the scriptures really clearly, isn't it? When you think St. Peter is constantly getting things wrong and he ends up being the first Pope. So with the example of the apostles, we shouldn't be surprised when we see problems arising among the hierarchy, should we?
Right. So maybe I could start by just kind of giving a quick summary of the 5 opinions that St. Robert Bellarmine covers, and then we can go more in depth, but just kind of give people an overview of the ground we're hoping to cover today, if that sounds good.
Yeah, sure, absolutely. So this is from his work, the Romano Pontifice.
Yes, and I have there's an English translation by a good friend of mine, Ryan Grant, and he has a publishing house called Mediatrix Press. So he did this translation. Um, and then there's another book that I'll probably refer to as well, which is part of his St. Robert Bellarmine's controversy. So this is Thomas 1, and then Thomas 2 covers other treatises, and this is Ryan's English translation of that. So
They're
Mediatrix
weighty
Press is where you can get
tomes,
those.
weighty tomes.
Yes, exactly.
There's a lot
Exactly.
to it. Okay, so the
So in
first point that Bellarmine makes is that a true pope can never become a heretic. Was the opinion of Albert. How do you say his name? Pigius.
Pigius, I think, yeah, a
Yeah.
Dutch theologian who died in 1542. Um, so yeah,
So
that's the
Bellarmine
first of,
says. So he basically says that that's rubbish. It's an extreme opinion.
well, actually, here, I'll pull it up and I'll read exactly what Bellarmine says. He actually said, such an opinion is probable and can easily be defended, as we will show in its proper place. But here, that's what I guess the Sedevacantis crowd kind of latches onto. But they seem to neglect this part. Bellarmine says, still, because it is not certain, and the common opinion is to the contrary, it will be worthwhile to see what the response should be if the Pope could be a heretic. So he's acknowledging, that's his. Bellarmine tends toward that opinion for, he doesn't want to think that the Pope could become a heretic, but he does acknowledge that the common opinion is to the contrary, and that's why he goes through the other 4 opinions to see, what's the true opinion. And we'll come back to Albert Pigius because he's important as well. I saw in the comments to our last video, I think I have it pulled up here on my screen. Someone commented, but there has never been a pope who was a manifest heretic. It is against church teaching. So maybe we should tackle that objection right away, and it kind of goes with this first opinion of Albert Pigius. So, and this person went on, I think, to invoke Vatican I. So let's actually look at what Vatican I teaches. I have my copy of another big tome here, another reference work, Denzinger, very important for theological students. And this is what Vatican I actually taught in Pastor Eternus in 1870, Pius IX, when he defined papal infallibility. This is the actual definition. That the Roman pontiff, when he speaks ex cathedra, that is, when acting in the office of shepherd and teacher of all Christians, he defines, by virtue of his supreme apostolic authority, a doctrine concerning faith or morals to be held by the universal church, possesses through the divine assistance promised to him in blessed Peter the infallibility with which the divine Redeemer willed his church to be endowed in defining doctrine concerning faith or morals, and that such definitions of the Roman pontiff are therefore irreformable of themselves, not because of the consent of the church. So that's what Vatican I teaches, and you can see there are very specific criteria that all have to be met simultaneously in order for a papal pronouncement to qualify as infallible. It's not just everything that comes out of his mouth. What's really interesting, though, in regard to this Albert Pigius figure is that during Vatican I, a week before that definition was made by Pius IX, there was a big discussion about the draft of the document, and one of the members of the doctrinal commission for the council, a bishop, Vincent Ferrer Gasser, he presented a 4-hour long intervention to explain the true meaning of the dogma that was going to be proclaimed. And that's the English translation is in a book from Ignatius Press called The Gift of Infallibility. I have a copy of it here. And he specifically addresses this issue of Albert Pigius, because there were men at the council who were concerned that that Pius IX and the council were wanting to raise to the level of a dogma this extreme minority opinion of Albert Pigius. So here's what Bishop Gasser explained to the council fathers. As far as the doctrine set forth in the draft of Pastor Eternus goes, the deputation, meaning the doctrinal commission, is unjustly accused of wanting to raise an extreme opinion, meaning that of Albert Pigius, to the dignity of a dogma. For the opinion of Albert Pigius, which Bellarmine indeed calls pious and probable, was that the Pope as an individual person or a private teacher was able to err from a type of ignorance, but was never able to fall into heresy or teach heresy. And he goes on to say, the doctrine in the proposed chapter is not that of Albert Pigius or the extreme opinion of any school. So there you have it. Vatican I did not raise to the level of a dogma this minority, what Bishop Gasser called an extreme opinion.
Absolutely. So you can see that that Gasser explicitly rejects the idea that Pastor Eternus dogmatizes Pigius's view as such,
Right,
because he calls it an extreme opinion. So that
right.
the council was not adopting that instead. But how is Pastor Eternus then? How are we saying that it's not dogmatizing that a pope can never become a heretic?
So in this text, what Gasser goes on to say, he says, basically the document, the opinion or the position that Pastor Eternus raises to the level of a dogma or adopts is the one and the same which Bellarmine teaches in the place cited by the reverend speaker, someone else speaking at that intervention apparently, and which Bellarmine adduces in the fourth place and calls most certain and assured. Now this is a different set of opinions, and I can show you appears in a different place in De Romano Pontifice, and I'll read to you what this is referring to. So in book 4, chapter 2 of the same De Romano Pontifice, Bellarmine is considering whether the judgment of the Pope is certain, and there are 4 different opinions on this. And the fourth one is the one that Bishop Gasser is referring to, and this is what it says. Let me back up to the third opinion. The third opinion is on another extreme, that the Pope cannot in any way be a heretic nor publicly teach heresy, even if he alone should define some matter, as Albert Pigius says. The fourth opinion, and this is what Bishop Gasser says relates to Pastor Eternus, is that in a certain measure, whether the Pope can be a heretic or not, he cannot define a heretical proposition that must be believed by the whole church in any way.
Ah, right.
This is
Okay.
this is a very common opinion of nearly all Catholics. So that's what Vatican I was saying, that the Pope, when he's speaking ex cathedra in his office as supreme pastor of the entire church, makes a definition on faith or morals that is binding upon the entire church. It's impossible for him to teach error in that particular circumstance, and that is true.
Yeah.
That's the actual teaching of the council.
Okay. We haven't really like this hasn't really come up before Pope Francis, has it? Particularly.
Not to my knowledge. I mean,
No.
like in the articles I've written about it, the one historical example that even comes close would be Pope John the 22nd back in the 1300s, when he publicly preached in 3 successive sermons that the souls of the faithful departed, even after if they needed to go to purgatory or whatever, they don't actually enjoy the beatific vision. They won't until the last judgment. And he was called out on that publicly by theologians and ended up correcting his position and adopting the more common opinion that no, they do, after they've been purified, or if they go straight to heaven, they do enjoy the beatific vision immediately upon entering heaven. And then his successor defined that as a dogma of the faith, basically. But yeah, you're right. I mean, no, we haven't really had a Francis situation in the history of the church, not to
Yeah.
this degree anyway.
And he's
So
not like it's interesting that you say that, Matt, because he hasn't really preached a homily or anything. He hasn't done anything. He hints at things, doesn't he? And it's sort of very sleight of hand. So we've had the Scalfari interviews, for example, and he just doesn't correct things, does he? Or the signing of the Abu Dhabi document where Bishop Schneider confronted him about the things that he'd said, that God wills all a plurality of religions.
right,
And he just says, "Oh no, that's not what I meant. I meant, it's not in his. He doesn't will it. It's
it's
in
his
his
permissive
permissive
will
will."
instead of his
Yeah.
positive will, something like that.
But then he went on to sort of reiterate the same point again recently in Singapore, didn't he? So you can see that the Cardinals. I mean, for any of this to work, the Cardinals would have to renounce him. They'd have to get together and form a sort of coalition
Right.
of
And
correction, wouldn't they?
definitely want to get to that too, because there are
Yeah.
two main schools of thought on that. But getting back to the 5 opinions of Bellarmine, so opinion number 2 I summarize it as a pope who falls into heresy, even secret or just merely internal heresy. So that would just be like the private sin, would immediately cut himself off from the church and thus lose his office. And Bellarmine rejects this opinion, which was held by a Cardinal Juan de Torquemada, who died in 1468, noting that its foundation, quote, is that secret heretics are outside the church, which is false, which would ultimately end up doing damage to the visibility of the church. Because if we couldn't have certainty about who was a member and who wasn't, then the church would no longer be formally visible, which is one of her attributes. So, but even more importantly than that point, Bellarmine observes here this crucial point, which totally undermines the position that the church, basically those of a sedevacantist mindset like to invoke Bellarmine and think that he teaches that the moment that if a pope were to publicly utter anything that's objectively heretical, from that moment he has lost the pontificate without any involvement of the church whatsoever. And that's not what Bellarmine teaches. He says, in response to the second opinion, for jurisdiction is certainly given to the pontiff by God, but with the agreement of men. for, meaning a conclave, a papal conclave, as is obvious, he says, because this man, who beforehand was not pope, has from men that he would begin to be pope. Therefore, he is not removed by God unless it is through men. So this proves that Bellarmine held that men, meaning members of the church's hierarchy specifically, must be involved in establishing the fact that a pope suspect of heresy is indeed guilty of the crime. And that's what he says in one of his other treatises, which is in this Thomas II, he writes about on the church. And this is what he talks about in book 1, chapter 9 of that treatise. He covers 6 different reasons why a general council of the church would be called. And he says, the 4th reason is suspicion of heresy in the Roman pontiff, if perhaps it might happen, or if he were an incorrigible tyrant. For then a general council ought to be gathered either to depose the pope if he should be found to be a heretic, or certainly to admonish him if he seemed incorrigible in morals. And he says also later in that same book of De Ecclesia, chapter 21, the Roman pontiff cannot be deprived of his right to summon councils and preside over them, unless he were first convicted by the legitimate judgment of a council and is not the supreme pontiff. So clearly Bellarmine held that the church, the hierarchy, has to be involved in establishing the fact. It's not simply the Pope says, for example, like Francis has done, all religions are a path to God, which he said last September, I think it was, in Singapore. Oh, that's objectively heretical. He's no longer the Pope. That's not how it works. That's not how Bellarmine says it works, or anyone else.
They're saying that basically there has to be a process of the magisterium, aren't they? That it has to be
Exactly.
the.
And it makes sense as to why that is. If it was just left up to the private judgment or private interpretation of private individuals, there would be chaos. We would never know who the true Pope is.
Mm,
It'd be Protestantism, basically.
yeah, based on your own opinion, sort of thing.
Right.
Okay, so what's the third one then? It's
Yes.
public and
So
pertinent heresy, isn't it?
the third opinion is basically a pope who falls into heresy, even manifest, meaning public and pertinacious. So it has been, by the word manifest, as we'll see, Bellarmine means that he's been warned by church authorities and remains obstinate in his error. That's what manifest means. The third opinion holds that he retains his office even in that circumstance and cannot be judged. And
So,
Bellarmine
like
calls
someone who brought an idol into the Vatican, into church or something like that, I mean, just plucking it out of the wind. If the
yeah.
Pope did something crazy like that.
Yes. So Bellarmine, and he's not the only one, he calls this opinion, quote, exceedingly improbable. Again, noting that, quote, in the case of heresy, a Roman pontiff can be judged. And what I've noted, and while I'm talking about this subject, I do want to give credit where credit is due, that a big reason why I know what I do know about all of this, I came to know the authors of this book back in 2016. The book is True or False Pope by John Salza and Robert Sisko, and it's packed full. I mean, it's a thick book, and they did a huge amount of research into all of this, looking at Bellarmine's teaching, Suarez, Cajetan, John of St. Thomas, um, and it's all there. They have the English translations of those Latin texts, the pertinent texts, in their book. So they really did a masterful job in that endeavor. Um, so yeah, it's in the case. The third opinion says, in the case of heresy, a Roman pontiff can be judged. And what I've noticed is that they often refer, and even Bellarmine refers to something in this when he's talking about the third opinion. He refers to something called, it's a medieval canon. Like before there was a code of canon law in one single volume, there were, different collections of traditional, customary church laws. And among those, there was something called the Canon C Papa, which basically says, I have the translation in another book here with me. this is what the Canon C Papa says. No mortal presumes to rebuke the Pope, since the one who is to judge all men is himself to be judged by no one, unless perhaps he should be found straying from the faith. And then there is also, Robert Bellarmine refers to a text by Pope Innocent III that says, and this was in a homily, I think, or a sermon for the consecration of a pontiff in the Middle Ages. Innocent III said, a pope can be judged by men, or rather be shown to be judged, if he loses his savor by way of heresy, for he who does not believe is already judged. So it just is reinforcing the fact that Bellarmine clearly held that the church, the hierarchy, has to be involved in this process. It's not just something that automatically happens after the Pope says something publicly that seems to be objectively heretical. So just to recap a little bit, we have the first opinion, which is that of Albert Pigius, that the Pope can never become a heretic, which Bellarmine says the common opinion is to the contrary. The second opinion, that a Pope who falls even into secret heresy would automatically cut himself off from the church and lose his office, and Bellarmine rejects that, as we've said. Opinion number 3 is that even if a pope becomes a manifest and an obstinate heretic after being warned by the church, he retains his office and cannot be judged, and Bellarmine rejects that as exceedingly improbable. So now we move on to the fourth opinion, which was that of Cardinal Thomas Cajetan, and this is kind of generally known as like the Dominican opinion. And those are the two main schools of thought that I mentioned earlier are the Jesuit school, or the Jesuit opinion, and the Dominican. And Bellarmine, as a Jesuit, is obviously representing the Jesuit opinion on the matter. So the fourth opinion is that of Cajetan, which Bellarmine summarizes as follows, quote, a manifestly heretical pope is not ipso facto deposed. Now remember, manifestly means he's already been warned by the church. So is not ipso facto by that very fact deposed, but can and ought to be deposed by the church. So the church needs to do something in addition to establishing the fact of heresy. Basically, according to the Dominican school of thought, the church needs to declare him someone to be avoided, and that is the means by which he is disposed to losing the pontificate. And then at that point, Christ himself separates the man from the pontificate, and he's no longer the pope, if that makes sense. And I'll summarize John and Robert give a great summary of this in their book, which we can get to in just a bit. So ultimately, Bellarmine gives lists of reasons as to why he disagrees with the Dominican school of thought, basically saying such an opinion cannot be defended. The Jesuit school basically says after the church establishes that the Pope is obstinate in heresy, there doesn't need to be anything additional after that point. Basically, the hierarchy would just need to issue some kind of a statement saying the Pope, he has already judged himself and has fallen from the papal office. Whereas the Dominican opinion says, no, the church actually, the hierarchy would need to issue a declaration or a statement saying, the faithful need to separate themselves from this man because he is a heretic, and that is what causes him to fall from office. That's the basic difference there. All right. So and then in this fourth opinion, I did want to mention something which is very important about this issue of warnings, because again, those of a sedevacantist mindset seem to think that Bellarmine teaches there doesn't need to be any involvement of the hierarchy in this process at all. There's not even a process, really. It's just if he says something objectively heretical, from that instant, he's no longer the Pope.
He's no longer the Pope.
So this is what Bellarmine says in regard to the fourth opinion. He says, now, in my judgment, such an opinion cannot be defended. For in the first place, that a manifest heretic would be ipso facto deposed is proven from authority and reason. The authority is of St. Paul, who commands St. Titus, chapter 3 of the Epistle to Titus, verses 10 to 11, that after 2 censures, that is, after he appears manifestly pertinacious, a heretic is to be shunned, and he understands this before excommunication and sentence of a judge. And this is the scripture passage that I mentioned in our first video, Titus 3, 10 to 11. Let me pull that up real quick just so I can read it so everybody can hear that and be on the same page. So this is what St. Paul wrote, and this is what all of the great theologians refer to with this issue of what to do with a heretic pope. They all refer to this passage. A man that is a heretic after the first and second admonition or correction avoid, knowing that he that is such a one is subverted and sinneth, being condemned by his own judgment. That's Titus 3, 10 to 11. And that's what they all refer to as the divine law, so to speak, regarding how to deal with this.
Right.
So in Bellarmine's view, that scripture proves that you just need to issue the corrections or the warnings, and then if the Pope appears manifestly pertinacious, he falls automatically without any further declaration on the part of the Church. And then here is his argument from reason. He says, now in regard to reason, this is indeed very certain. A non-Christian cannot in any way be Pope, as Cajetan affirms in the same book. And the reason is because he cannot be the head of that which he is not a member. And he is not a member of the Church who is not a Christian. But a manifest heretic is not a Christian, as St. Cyprian and many other fathers clearly teach. Therefore, a manifest heretic cannot be Pope. But again, it's very important to understand the word manifest. It doesn't just mean that he's publicly uttered something that's objectively heretical. Bellarmine says, after 2 censures, that is, after he appears manifestly pertinacious, something that's determined by the church authorities, not by some private individual in the pew. That's the main point.
All right. Now, okay, so explain that seems to contradict the 5th opinion, which is that a pope who is manifest heretic ceases in himself to be the pope and head, just as he ceases to be in himself a Christian and a member of the body of the church. So, is that saying that irrespective of whether the hierarchy, deal with the problem or not, he ceased to be pope on a individual level?
Yeah, so that, and Salza and Cisco just do a great job of discussing this in their book and showing very clearly that there is a difference, as I mentioned, between the Jesuit school of thought represented by Bellarmine and Suarez, and then the Dominican school of thought represented by Cajetan and John of St. Thomas. So let me just go through, and they have in their book the differences between the two opinions, in chapter 11. This is page 357. So here is the sequence for as Salza and Cisco say in their book, the sequence of events for the Jesuit school. Number 1 is the establishment of the crime. The criminal phase, in which the church establishes the crime of heresy through warnings, and may also issue a declaratory sentence of the crime. The crime established by the church, by which the Pope ceases to be a member of the church, is the dispositive cause which disposes him to lose his office. And then the number 2 in the Jesuit way of thinking is divine punishment / deposition, which is automatic ipso facto loss of office by an act of Christ, who severs the bond between the man and the pontificate. And they explain this is the efficient cause for the loss of office. That's what actually brings it about. And then finally, step number 3 is the declaration of deprivation and / human punishment. The church declares that the Pope has lost his office due to heresy, but that it's already happened. It's not the result of the church finding out this fact. They're just simply declaring it so the faithful know that. This merely confirms that the loss of office has already taken place, Salza and Cisco explain. The former Pope is then excommunicated, and if heresy is a violation of civil law, as it was in his day, he would be turned over to the secular power for punishment. So that's the Jesuit opinion on the matter. Now, here is the sequence of events for the Dominican school. And notice that the first step is exactly the same, the establishment of the crime. So the criminal phase in which the church establishes the crime through warnings and issues a declaratory sentence of the crime. This phase precedes the actual deposition. Step number 2, the church juridically commands the faithful that the Pope, who has been found guilty of heresy, must be avoided. This juridical act causes the disposition that renders him incapable of governing the church. And then the divine punishment comes after that. Christ authoritatively severs the bond that unites the man to the office, thereby causing the man to fall from the pontificate. And then finally, step number 3, according to the Dominican school of thought, human punishment. The former pope could then be excommunicated by the church and or punished by the civil authority. But again, the crucial point in all of this is that both schools agree that the church, meaning the hierarchy, must be involved in two things. Number 1, establishing pertinacity on the part of the allegedly heretical pope by means of those warnings mentioned by St. Paul in his letter to Titus. And then number 2, declaring the fact of his pertinacity should he spurn fraternal correction, in order to give the faithful moral certitude that he has indeed lapsed into formal heresy. They both agree on that point. There's no disagreement at all.
And the only difference really is that the Dominican school is saying that it's the juridical act of the church that then causes the loss of office.
Or disposes
Whereas,
him to, yeah, it basically renders him incapable of governing the church, because if the entire hierarchy says this man is guilty of heresy and is not fit, cannot continue to be the head of the church, that is what disposes him to lose his office. I mean, Christ is the one who ultimately severs the man from the office in both scenarios. But the Dominican basically just says there needs to be an extra step. It's not the hierarchy not only has the duty of fact finding and declaring that he is pertinacious, they also need to issue some sort of a declaration saying that the faithful must separate themselves from this man who is a heretic. That's the extra step involved, according to the Dominican school of thought.
so the
Now, I guess,
crucial point is that we need the church hierarchy to establish, well, to act to what Cardinal Burke has described as a formal act of correction. That's what we need
yes.
the hierarchy to do. And so far they haven't done that, have they? But they've come pretty close.
Yeah, I mean, the closest they've come in as far, and even we're talking about like the entire college of bishops, not just a handful of them. We need the entire hierarchy to be involved. That's how these great theologians like Cajetan and Suarez, Bellarmine, John of St. Thomas, they didn't envision this being just a little quorum of men from the hierarchy. They envisioned a general council of the church. So they assumed that the entire hierarchy would be up in arms if a pope said something heretical. Unfortunately, that's not the case in our day. Most of them don't even seem to care. So
But
that's the
isn't that
issue.
interesting? Like, how have we got here? Is
Yeah.
that like we're suffering from a factionalization, aren't we? Like, that there are factions, and it's interesting because we're looking at it from the perspective of two sort of spiritual charisms, like the
Mm-hmm.
Dominican charism and the Jesuit the charism, and yet it seems that what is it in the church that's caused us to lose our love of orthodoxy to the point where those factions have become so politicized that it's
Mm-hmm.
more about political wrangling, isn't it, rather than orthodoxy?
Right. Well, a couple of scripture passages come to mind in that regard. I'm going to open up my scripture website here. I don't have my Bible. I should have it on my desk. I forgot to grab that. Actually, let me just reach behind me real quick. I'll grab it. So of course, in regard to the end times is kind of what I was thinking about, and none of us know the day or the hour. We don't know if when Christ will come again in glory to judge the living and the dead, but he has given us certain signs that will precede his coming, and one of them is he says the love of many will grow cold. I know that's somewhere in one of his end times discourses. I think it's Matthew chapter 24. Let me see if I'm remembering this correctly. Here we go. So he says, let's see here. He talks about there being wars and rumors of wars. Nation will rise against nation, kingdom against kingdom. But then he talks about many false prophets shall arise and shall seduce many. And because iniquity or sin hath abounded, the charity of many will grow cold. And I don't think he's only talking about, like fraternal charity of caring about one another, love your neighbor as yourself. I think he's also talking about love of the truth, because in Second Thessalonians, in this famous chapter 2, where St. Paul is talking about, because there were a lot of people in St. Paul's day who apparently thought that the second coming was imminent, and they were kind of neglecting their duties and were just kind of going a little crazy. And he tells them, we beseech you, brethren, by the coming of our Lord Jesus Christ and our gathering together unto him, that you be not easily moved from your sense, nor be terrified, neither by spirit, nor by word, nor by epistle, as sent from us, as if the day of the Lord were at hand. Let no man deceive you by any means, for unless there come a revolt, and the word in Greek there is actually apostasy. And a lot of people
Right.
point to this verse as referring to a great apostasy in the church.
Mm.
And the man of sin
Like
revealed.
that's sort of the Latter-day Saints position, isn't it?
It's part of that, yeah. But I mean, there's a lot of good Catholic exegesis on this, and actually, our friend Dr. Taylor Marshall talks about this in his book
The
Apocalypse
great.
and
Oh, right,
Antichrist and Apocalypse. That's a great
right.
book. I enjoyed that read. So, talking about this apostasy that's going to come before our Lord comes again, the great falling away from the faith, and the man of sin, of course, being the Antichrist. Um, and St. Paul also talks about a couple verses later the mystery of iniquity, um, and the coming of the Antichrist. And then verse 10 is what I had in mind. And in all seduction of iniquity to them that perish, because they receive not the love of the truth, that they might be saved. Therefore God shall send them the operation of error to believe lying, that all may be judged who have not believed the truth, but have consented to iniquity. So I think it's pretty clear that before Christ comes again, and we might be seeing in our own day, there is going to be the love of many, not only for each other, but for love for the truth is going to grow cold. And I think that's the situation that we're in the church right now. There are very
Mm.
few people, especially there are very few men, especially within the hierarchy. There's probably more love for the truth among the laity in our day than there is among the hierarchy. At least that's how it seems to me.
Yeah, it's funny because I was having a conversation earlier today with some people who have contacted me because they work for the church and
Hmm.
they've basically been in a situation where I'm been trying to be careful what I say, but that where basically it's just extremely poorly managed. And I always
Hmm.
think the parable of the wicked vineyard renters, always comes to mind that what will when they kill. He said that the vineyard owner sends his son and they kill his son, and obviously that's a direct reference to the Jews. But
Hmm.
you've got this feeling that our bishops, that somewhat iconic image of Dolan and Supich laughing it up at McElroy's
Hmm.
installation seemed
Right.
to really get people animated. And, like this conversation I was having was basically that there's no due diligence, that people are giving money to the church and they're wasting it. And it just puts you in mind. It seems to be a common theme throughout the church at the moment that the people in charge. If we've got a crisis, Matt, it seems to be a crisis of leadership, doesn't it? We don't have,
Yes.
insofar as the crisis exists, it's like we've got no leaders. And part of that is that it seems like the church hierarchy are terrified of having anyone with any flavour, with any salt, aren't they? Like that. They want everything to be vanilla, to be milk toast, so
Hmm.
that we don't upset anyone or anything like that. And yet Jesus was overturning the money lenders' tables and whipping people out the temple. He
Hmm.
wasn't frightened of upsetting people if they were wrong. We've lost our courage as Catholics, haven't we? We've lost our
Hmm.
ability to be able to discern the truth, even. With the US aid thing, the bishops are up in arms. America Magazine today's got a lead about Catholics, you know, um, who are demonstrating against the closure of US aid. But like people, we're all over the place, aren't we? And part of that is that we haven't got a good pope who's clear about these applying doctrine to these modern issues. Would you agree?
Hmm. Yeah, absolutely. And there's I think it was St. John Eudes. Let me see if I can pull this up quickly and read this quote, but he has some very stark words as far as when we have bad leaders, sometimes it's a reflection on our own, the state of the church in general, the entire human element of the church. Um, let's see here. Let me try. I think I can pull this up real quick and read this quote. So several years ago, I wrote an article on the sixth anniversary of Pope Francis, and it happened to be March of 2019, and it was snowing where I live, and so I had this idea for an article outlasting the long winter of this pontificate. Um, and I quoted from St. John Eudes. Yes, it was. He was a French priest, he founder of the Society of Jesus and Mary, and he offers some very sobering words for us to reflect on, maybe especially during the Lenten season, in his book, The Priest, His Dignity and Obligations. This is what he says. The most evident mark of God's anger and the most terrible castigation he can inflict upon the world are manifested when he permits his people to fall into the hands of clerics who are priests more in name than in deed, priests who practice the cruelty of ravening wolves rather than the charity and affection of devoted shepherds. Instead of nourishing those committed to their care, they rend and devour them brutally. Instead of leading their people to God, they drag Christian souls to hell in their train. Instead of being the salt of the earth and the light of the world, they are its innocuous poison and its murky darkness. When God permits such things, it is a very positive proof that he is thoroughly angry with his people and is visiting his most dreadful anger upon them. That is why he cries unceasingly to Christians, "Return, O ye revolting children, and I will give you pastors according to my own heart," which is from the book of Jeremiah, chapter 3. Thus, irregularities in the lives of priests, and surely popes as well, constitute a scourge visited upon the people in consequence of sin. And as I mentioned in my article, this doesn't mean that God positively wills the corruption which bad priests, bishops, and popes have wrought in his church. He permits it, and it also doesn't imply that the faithful are responsible for the individual sins and crimes of the clergy. But what I would say is what it does mean is that our personal striving for sanctity or lack thereof has a real effect, for better or for worse, on the overall spiritual health of the mystical body of Christ.
It's
So,
quite
especially,
terrifying, really, isn't it? What so?
yes.
What would be the right thing to do to remedy this? Do you think?
Well, I mean, as I concluded that two-part series I wrote last December for LifeSite, discussing the situation with Pope Francis, is he the Pope, is he not the Pope, and laying out my position, which is essentially what we've been talking about today. Um,
Which is that he is the Pope. He's just not a very good Pope,
right. Um,
or at
you know,
least he's the
ulti-
Pope until the cardinals decide he isn't, sort of thing.
right. I think two main points, kind of to wrap up what we were discussing with those opinions. Something I think
Mm.
it's very important to recall. something that Bishop Schneider wrote in 2019 on this very subject, because obviously it's been debated for years now. People have been claiming that Francis is not the Pope for one reason or another. But he wrote in a piece for 1 Peter 5 in 2019, the issue of how to handle a heretical pope in concrete terms has not yet been treated in a manner which approaches anything like a true general consent in the entire Catholic tradition. So far, Bishop Schneider says, neither a pope nor an ecumenical council has made relevant doctrinal pronouncements, nor have they issued binding canonical norms regarding the eventuality of how to handle a heretical pope during the term of his office. The opinion which says that a heretical pope ipso facto loses his office, which is the Jesuit school of the thought, as we've seen, became a common opinion starting with the High Middle Ages until the 20th century. It remains a theological opinion and not a teaching of the church, and therefore it cannot claim the quality of a constant and perennial teaching of the church as such, since no ecumenical council and no pope has supported such an opinion explicitly. So, unfortunately, at least at this time in history, we don't have the definitive answer of what to do in the situation of a Pope Francis. It would be really nice if someday a pope and or a council dealt with this issue and issued definitive norms on what to do if we end up in this situation. I think personally that needs to be done by the
Yeah,
hierarchy.
and it
So,
might, it could, well, this could be the thing that prompts it to happen, I suppose, couldn't
right.
it? Because it does
But
look like, would you
yeah.
say that Cardinal Burke, like the Dubia cardinals, if you like, and have been trying to garner support for some sort of, didn't Burke talk about an open correction or something like that? And then it
Yeah,
just
and
never followed through, did it, from the last set
right.
of Dubia?
Yeah, in the I guess it was in December of 2016, after the dubia for Amoris Laetitia had been made public a couple months earlier, he did in a couple of interviews talk about if the Pope doesn't respond to the dubia, which he never has, that set of dubia, then they would have to issue a formal fraternal correction, which would basically be one of those warnings that St. Paul mentions in Titus chapter 3, but for whatever reason it never materialized. And that's really what we need to at least have a first step towards dealing with the problem. But then I think the other main point is that ultimately, as much as we'd like to put everything on Francis, the crisis that we're facing is decades long. It didn't
Mm.
begin with Francis. And ultimately, it goes back to what we've been facing really since the Second Vatican Council. Professor Roberto de Mattei gave a speech in 2018 at the Catholic Identity Conference, the same conference that you and I met at last fall. And he gave some very, I always go back to this quote because I think it's so poignant. He says, the pontificate of Pope Francis certainly represents a leap forward in the process of the Church's auto-demolition. That's Paul VI's famous phrase, I think from 1968, following the Second Vatican Council. However, this is only a stage, the last one in this process. We could say that it represents its ripe fruit. The essence of the Second Vatican Council was the triumph of pastoral theology over doctrine, the transformation of pastoral theology into a theology of praxis, the application of the philosophy of Marxist practice to the life of the church. For the communists, the true philosopher is not Karl Marx, the revolution's theorist, but Lenin, who carried out the revolution, proving Marxist thought. For neo-modernists, the true theologian is not Karl Rahner, the famous dissenting Jesuit, the principal ideologue of the revolution in the church, but rather Pope Francis, says De Mattei, who is fulfilling this revolution, putting Rahner's thought into pastoral practice. So ultimately, he concludes this section of his talk by saying Pope Francis represents Vatican II in action. Now, I know that there are disagreements, and obviously there's a lot in the council that is perfectly orthodox. But I think we also know that there are certain time bombs that were put in there. I think that was a phrase of Michael Davies, time bombs that were set to go off, and the the modernists who put them there, like the theological experts who were drafting the documents and things, they knew how they were going to exploit those ambiguities after the council, and Francis is doing that to an unprecedented degree. That's how I see it.
Mm. Well, yeah, I don't know. It's interesting because I kind of think that, I think that we're doing the wrong thing when we place everything on the council, because the problems that we saw or that we see manifest since the council were certainly things that were embedded in the church leading up to the council. I mean, any history that you read, these weren't problems. The problems that we saw coming out of Vatican II were things that were, the pressures, if you like, that led up to Vatican II, aren't they? So they didn't come out of the blue, like, or as a result
Right,
of
right.
what was taught at Vatican II. And I always think that so what does that tell us? Going back to that brilliant quote that you put there, it's that we've lost our faith, that the leaders have lost their way somehow. And you could just as easily, if you contrast the approach of Pope Benedict XVI, who was much more interested in reading the council documents in an orthodox way,
Hmm.
we know, like we were always going on about it, but what he called the hermeneutic of continuity, I
Yeah.
mean, like he was, I think that is a beautiful exposition of our choice as Catholics. We can either choose to read the council documents in continuity with everything that the church taught de fide before that, or we can
Hmm.
choose a hermeneutic of rupture. Now, I totally agree that Pope Francis is de facto the hermeneutic of rupture. He is the manifestation of the hermeneutic of rupture, because
Right.
what he's saying, he doesn't understand. I mean, it seems to me, and this might sound a bit arrogant, but I think it's easily demonstrable that he doesn't understand the teaching of Vatican II, and he doesn't seem very familiar with the documents either. But what he is familiar with is the spirit of Vatican II, and that
Right.
is, as far as he's concerned, a complete break with everything that went before. And that is what Benedict XVI said was the hermeneutic of rupture, isn't it? So, it's like that. If you look at what the theology that he quotes in his documents, it nothing before Vatican II, and usually just himself. This sort of circular logic. But it's like everything changed at Vatican II, and now we've got a new church going forward, and that is the synodal church. This is the way that the synod, that Cardinal Grech, and that are talking, and Hollerich are talking about the synod on synodality and the way that
Right.
that moves forward. And so they're literally trying to set up a new church within the church, and I'd say that they're using Vatican II as a way of validating that or justifying it. But in the same way that coming out of the council, you had Pope John Paul II sorting out a lot of the theological issues with encyclicals like the obvious one is Veritatis Splendor, isn't it? Where he looked at all those conflicting moral ideas and just one by one knocked the skittles down really brilliantly. But I mean, like talking to Professor Larry Chapp about this,
Hmm.
I've sort of in a private conversation, I've said I thought we were done with this. I thought the theology had been, but like it's been metastasizing behind the scenes, and now you've got Pope Francis has allowed it all to come out again, and we end up having crazy conversations about what St. Robert Bellarmine said about how to get rid of a heretical pope,
Right.
which is just compared to all those years of where we were all so on side with the papacy. It's very difficult, isn't it, for Catholics?
Yeah, it certainly is. Yeah, and I think you're right. I mean, I don't want to imply that I think everything is the fault of the council. Ultimately, there's a great book that's going to be coming out later this month by a friend of mine named Kennedy Hall from Sophia Institute Press, and it's called "What Happened to Catholicism." I'm going to be interviewing him about that in a couple of weeks. He asked me. I'm very honored to have written the foreword for the book, but it's basically about the modernist crisis in the church, which started in the um, you know the first rumblings of it were in the early to mid 1800s as the movement of liberal Catholicism, and then you have the modernist movement in the late 1800s, early 1900s, And this is what was really at the rotten core of all of the um, what Sister Lucia of Fatima famously called the diabolical disorientation in the church.
Well, and
Um,
you can see that in the papal encyclicals that have been written, like Humana Generis was,
yeah,
about this, wasn't it?
Freemasonry,
And
yes,
yeah, Pascendi Dominici Gregis was about it,
yes,
and and so you can see the popes had identified what the main problem was, even going
right,
back that far. And now we're seeing like the full metastasization, really, aren't we, of all those
right.
problems?
And ultimately, this is what our friend Taylor Marshall describes. He gives an overview of that history in his book Infiltration, that it's been like a 150-year process from beginning from the early 1800s and then really um, showing itself kind of publicly manifesting and in an unprecedented way in and through the council because of some of the appointments and the theological experts who were allowed to kind of wreak havoc and do some kind of an inside job, I guess, during the council, planting some certain ambiguities, not outright heresies, but things that could be exploited after the council, which is what we see men like Francis and Supich and Hollerich and all those kind of
McElroy,
guys
yeah.
doing, McElroy, all those people doing now.
Mm.
Yeah.
And the only way they get away with it is by, you know, if we don't know the documents better. I think like McElroy, Katherine and I just we were having a conversation. I think, and Gavin, the last conversation we were having, and we were talking about a brilliant article that Sebastian Morello had written on our website.
Mm-hmm.
And in the end, we started talking about Dignitatis Humanae and the way that Cardinal McElroy had recently used it to push another heretical position, which was
Mm-hmm.
basically that Catholics have got no right to the sacraments. No, fundamentally that's the manifestation of it. So in the COVID crisis, they shut the churches because civil authorities got precedence, and he's
Mm-hmm.
basing that on like three words in Dignitatis Humanae number 2. And she sort of caught me out of off guard with it. But like afterwards, I was reading through the document, and if you read Dignitatis Humanae paragraph 13, it it's got the proper teaching. It's got something
Mm-hmm.
that sort of contradicts that. But it's like if we haven't got that stuff at our fingertips, when someone like Cardinal McElroy quotes a Vatican II document, you go, oh, blind, like I was caught right off guard because I was like, oh, I didn't know
Mm-hmm.
I didn't know that it taught that. I'm not massively familiar with that particular document, whereas I've studied the controversy, say, in Lumen Gentium. I know where the pitfalls are, so it's easier
Yeah.
then to talk about it. And you've got people like, wonderful Dr. Ralph Martin, who did his doctoral thesis on Lumen Gentium 8, I think it is, in, which is Will Many Be Saved? So this idea that some people took Leonardo Boff was one of them from the council, and he was condemned for it afterwards. That
Mm-hmm.
basically, other ecclesial bodies have got elements of the Catholic faith, and that makes them on a par. But that was not what was said in the document at all. And uh,
Mm-hmm.
Ralph Martin goes on to prove that. And obviously, the big post synodal, post conciliar document that resolved that issue was Dominus Jesus, which was very clear teaching, wasn't it? But the fact that the ambiguity was in the original document, as you say, is demonstrated by the need for Dominus Jesus to be put out by the CDF afterwards, isn't it?
And I think something that Bishop Schneider has said even recently, he said this during a recent interview with Joe McLean on a Catholic Take, a radio program, that the next pope, Joe asked him basically, what does the next pope need to do to deal with the crisis that we're in? And one thing that Bishop Schneider said is really issue a document clearly identifying and condemning the primary errors of our day, which is what the popes have always done. That's like
Yeah.
that's the core part of their job description, is to condemn error and more clearly articulate the truth. That's what we need them to do. That's what our Lord said, confirm your brethren in the faith. That's what we need from the Pope. So
Matt, that's
That I,
beautiful. That's exactly, I couldn't agree more. That's exactly what we need. And that's what we're missing, isn't it, today? Really, in the church is that because we need to be countercultural. That's the whole point of being Catholic, really, is to call out the errors in our society. And with the Pope that we've got, that's just not happening. And the bishops, unfortunately. So perhaps that's a good place at an hour to call it a day. It was a fascinating conversation. Thanks ever so much for joining me again. And we have to think up what we're going to do in the next one now.
yes.
Good
Yes,
stuff.
maybe I
Okay.
can put some of this into writing in an article for the website at some point. I'll see if I
Yeah,
can
that'd be
do that.
brilliant. Yeah. And would you send us the links that you were talking about, especially the life site articles that you wrote, and
Hmm.
the one about the snow, and we'll put it in the show notes for everyone so they can check those out. So this
Yes.
has been, thank you very much, Matt Gaspers, for being with us, and we'll catch up with you again soon. Thanks everyone for watching. Please, click like and do all those things, subscribe and share it and all that stuff. It really helps us grow the channel. And I hope you found it interesting and stimulating. Leave a comment if you can and let us know what you thought. And we'll see you again soon on Catholic Unscripted.